Okay, so this is lecture 2 of part 2 of the life and thought of Moses Maimonides, and today we're starting the Sefer Ahavah, translated by Troster as the Book of Adoration, which are all about the laws of prayer. And one of the interesting things is when you look in the tradition, in the Hebrew editions, at the end of the Sefer Ahavah, they literally have all of his versions of the prayers. In other words, a whole Siddur, essentially, which is not included, obviously, in the English translation. But if you want to know, what Maimonides' versions of any form of prayer should be, they're printed here, which is quite fascinating. In other words, it's Seder Tefillot Kol HaShana, the order of prayer for the entire year. The only thing he doesn't have in here is the Passover Haggadah, which is actually covered in his section on holidays. He actually, again, gives you his whole version of the Haggadah. Anyway, so he begins with the recitation of the Shema, which is the considered to be the prayer par excellence in the Jewish tradition. Only it's not a prayer. It's not part of any of the classical categories of prayer. The classical categories of prayer, of course, are request, thanks or gratitude, and praise. And 99% of all of Jewish prayers fall into one of those categories, and the 1%, so to speak, is the Shema. The Shema is more of a declaration of faith. As one middle schooler once said to me, it's the Pledge of Allegiance. And I thought that's really a great way to describe it. Exactly it. And in fact, when you look at the prayer service, the morning prayer service especially, as a whole, you see a kind of metaphorical journey there of going up to the temple and swearing allegiance before the king. And then what follows then is the Amidah, which is then when you make your requests, right? But before you can ask the king for anything, you have to prove you're a loyal subject. So there's a kind of metaphorical thing in that regard. Secondly, it's also a metaphorical reenacting of Mount Sinai, where everybody at Mount Sinai accepts the sovereignty of God, and we see in the various biblical texts there were mass gatherings of the Israelites to reaffirm their loyalty to the covenant, and these mass gatherings, which do appear as late as the time of Ezra, we're not sure how regular they were. They may, in fact, have occurred on a regular basis in later First Temple times. It's all a matter of speculation, really. But it seems that the Shema replaced such things. So again, this is part of the democratization and decentralization of Judaism that began in Second Temple period and continued much more after the destruction of the Second Temple, where you didn't need the temple. You could, in effect, worship God anywhere, anytime, any place. So the saying of the Shema, therefore, is a reenacting of the Sinai acceptance of the covenant at Mount Sinai, and I think that's another really important symbolic structure. So you have these two symbolic structures laid on top of one another. So there's also evidence back into the 2nd century BCE that Jews were in fact reciting the Shema. There's some textual evidence for that. And the Shema, of course, consists of 3 paragraphs. So if you take a look on page 87 for the laws of the Shema, Maimonides, first of all, says there's one positive Torah commandment. This is in the extra material I gave you, the mitzvot to recite the Shema twice daily. And that is the tradition, to recite it in the morning service and to recite it as part of the evening service. Then there's 2 other times it ends up being recited as well as part of the preliminary service, the Birkot HaShachar, the morning blessings, and there's a tradition of reciting the Shema before you go to bed. The idea being that since nighttime is a time when a lot of people die, the last thing you're supposed to say before you die is the Shema. That's the reason for doing it before you go to sleep. So let's take a look on page 87 where he points this out. We don't really have to read through this because he's pretty straightforward about this. He says it's recited twice every day because in the first paragraph of the Shema itself, it says when you lie down and when you rise up. And this, of course, if you remember, for when those of you who studied brachot with me, there was a whole discussion about exactly what that is and so on and so forth. But the point is that it's done at night and in the morning. And then in paragraph 2, he gives you the 3 paragraphs of the Shema, which 2 are from Deuteronomy, 1 is from Numbers. And if you take a look, it says, the section beginning, Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael, is recited first because it set forth the duty of acknowledging the unity of God, loving Him, and studying His words. This is the great and essential matter on which all depends. And this is hearkening back to the Yesodei HaTorah, the foundation of the principles of the Torah. And because for Maimonides, of course, the recitation of the unity of God, and that's how he interprets the Shema, is that it refers to God's unity, and of course that's the common understanding of it, that we are proclaiming the unity of God. The original meaning of it, in fact, probably means something is more of a loyalty thing. The Hear, O Israel, Yud He Vav He is our God. Yud He Vav He is our God alone, rather than one. In other words, it can be interpreted as that we serve no other gods. Maimonides is taking the more typical interpretation of it, that God is a unity, there's only one God, but in the more complicated way in which he understands it. And then, of course, in the first paragraph of the Shema, following that first line, is the command to love God. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol meodecha. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. So that's where you have that. And then, of course, it says, and studying his words, because in the first paragraph, there is the idea that one should teach these to your children, wear it a sign upon your heart and between your doorposts. So there you have the mitzvah of Talmud Torah and of tefillin and of mezuzah. So in other words, the first paragraph is about loyalty, love, and teaching. The second paragraph, Ahayim Shemoah, from chapter 11, Deuteronomy, is about the covenant itself, the command to follow the covenant. And the third section is about the laws of the tzitzit as a way of remembering the covenant. So those are the classic understandings of the 3 parts of the Shema, which Maimonides does it. 1 second, Robert. The first paragraph is referred to Kabbalat Ol Malchut, accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, Malchut Shamayim, and the second paragraph is always referred to as accepting the yoke of the commandments. All right? Yes, Robert, you had a question or a comment?
It deals with Echad. I'm very comfortable with the translation of only.
Yes.
I don't understand what is meant by unity.
There's only, the Cantor's got it right. First of all, there's only one God, but also God is a unity in itself. There are no parts to God. See, in other words, you can talk about unity as a numerical quality, or you can talk about it as a quality of essence, you might say, right? So that's how you can understand it in 2 different ways, the concept of unity.
Because of the root, you can expand.
Yeah, that God can't be divided into sections.
You have to be a spiritual person to...
No, you just have to speak Hebrew.
Very good, Cantor. I like that. In other words, he talks about it here he says, Mipnei sheyesh ba yichud Hashem, the unity of God. Okay? So for Maimonides, it's not, and he talked about this back at the beginning of the foundations of the Torah. It's not for him numerical. It's not a numerical thing. It's to him, it's that God has an essential unity, and there are no parts to God. That God is, is perfect. Unlike, remember, he compared, the difference between us. Right? We have all different kinds of parts, that make up who we are, our body, our form, the expression of who we are, and God doesn't have that. And that, of course, was why he, of course, is radically anti-anthropomorphic about God, and why all, therefore, anthropomorphic statements about God must be metaphors. Okay? Satisfied?
Is this an also opposition to the Trinity?
Yeah, there's a certain sense of that, and yeah, there's a certain sense of that. I would agree. Yeah, absolutely. Maimonides, as you will see, was particularly critical of Christianity for those various reasons.
But Cantor, you're quite comfortable with the alternative translation of the only.
It's not alternative. It's the same value.
You know what it is? The word echad can have multiple meanings.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
and that's why I'm saying I think Louis Jacobs, in one of his books, listed 20 interpretations of the Shema that have been found in classical Jewish sources. So it shows you that the whole thing itself can come to mean a variety of ways of
It also
approach.
depends what addition you put on the root.
Yeah.
Like echad is one, me'uchad is united, meyuchad is special.
Special, unique.
Yichud is to make something special. I mean, there's so many options in the language.
Right.
That once it's like things that you kind of hear it as in context.
Yeah. Sam?
Since you learn to speak.
How would Mordecai Kaplan interpret this?
You got me there. I'm not sure, but that's a good question.
He didn't translate it. That's in the
Reconstructionists?
In the Reform.
They leave it as a chad.
What do you call it? Gates of Prayer.
Yeah, they leave
when
it.
they had 10 Friday night services.
Yeah.
The one that had the Reconstructionist overtones did not have English under the Shema.
Huh? Interesting. I'd actually have to go back and take a look at that, Sam. It's a good question. I will look that up for you.
I remember that.
There's actually a new book about Mordecai Kaplan. Mel Skult, who I met recently, is an expert on Kaplan. He just published a whole new book about Kaplan's theology, by the way. Okay, so paragraph 3, he talks about the fringes, how the tzitzit are not recited at night. And then in number 4, he talks about how we're supposed to, after the first thing we say, the thing we're supposed to say quietly, which I know Reform services say out loud, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, right? Except traditionally it's recited quietly because it's not part of the original biblical text, but it's only recited aloud on Yom Kippur traditionally, he tells why he gives a rabbinic tradition as to why this sentence is supposed to be recited. Why is it added? But what I wanted to do, Tversky then doesn't give you anything else from the Shema. That's why I gave you the extra material, because I actually thought that there's some very interesting material that Tversky chooses to skip. So if you go to the part extra sections from the Mishneh Torah, laws of prayer, let's take a look at the part that is about the laws of Kriyat Shema. That's the Hebrew for the recitation of the Shema. So chapter 2, Halacha 1 is really important, actually. Suzanne, you want to read it?
Okay, Halacha 1. One who recites the first verse of Kriyat Shema, that is, Shema Yisrael, without intention, does not fulfill his obligation. One who recites the rest without intention fulfills his obligation. Even a person studying Torah in his usual way or proofreading these portions at the time of Kriyat Shema fulfills his obligation provided he concentrates his intention for the first verse.
So, in other words, the saying of the Shema is not, the mitzvah of saying the Shema is not fulfilled by just reciting it. And that in itself is a very interesting thing, because we usually in our tradition, again, I think I've mentioned this before, say as long as you do something, it doesn't matter how you feel about it, but in fact this is one of those sections where everything depends on it. And in the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides at one point says how difficult it is to properly say the Shema, that it comes after what he calls years of training, right? And it's the reason why, by the way, traditionally people cover their eyes when they recite the Shema. I mean, you don't have to put your hand in front, you can close your eyes. Some people put their prayer books in front of their eyes. The point is, the whole point of doing that is to block out distractions and to focus on it. You have to say it like you mean it.
This
Right?
is only the first.
Yeah.
The first line. Yeah.
And the rest doesn't count?
The rest does count, okay? But that's the one that absolutely has to be done. Because think about it. Again, if we see it as a loyalty oath, right, you have to, when you say it, you have to truly believe it, right? Not just, it's the difference between, if we call it the Pledge of Allegiance, it's the difference between just mumbling the Pledge of Allegiance and doing it with passion, right? As if it's your words. So for Maimonides, this is incredibly important in his whole idea of learning to discipline yourself, to elevate your mind through study and action and proper attitudes towards the apprehension of God. Yeah,
The word kiryat, what does that mean?
that means recitation,
Recitation.
kriyat. Okay? Suzanne, why don't you read Halacha 9 now?
How must one enunciate?
This is very interesting,
He
actually.
must be careful not to pronounce a letter with a strong dagesh as if there were no dagesh, or a letter with no dagesh as if there were one.
Okay, now what is a dagesh? A dagesh is a period mark in the middle of a sentence. Certain letters, my biblical Hebrew teacher called them the begath gafats, because if you take all of them, that's what the word comes out to. Are sometimes with a dagesh and sometimes without a dagesh. Now, in the case of the letter bet, for example, with a dagesh it's bet, without one it's vet. That's an easy one, all right? But when you get to gimel and daled, we don't really pronounce it anymore. We don't make a difference when we pronounce a gimel with a dagesh or without, or a daled dagesh, but there was a difference. The daled without a dagesh is a softer D, more of a DTH sound. The Irish actually, I think, do that. And the same thing with the gimel. And I think it's closer to certain things that are done in Arabic, actually. But the point is, there are several letters that we just now pronounce exactly the same. Okay? So that's the interesting thing, that Maimonides being, at the time he was in, people still made a pronunciation distinction between letters with a dagesh and without a dagesh, that we don't make a distinction anymore. And modern Hebrew doesn't make the distinction anymore.
Was the dagesh there for every letter? Or
No,
certain
just
ones?
the begath gafat. Just only
Only
six letters. Okay? 6 letters. Beit, Gimel, Daled, Pei, Kuf,
Half
Chaf,
and tough.
and Taf. Okay? So in
But that's only the gesh kal. There's 2 different geshim.
yeah, I know, but that's a different thing. Because in some cases, a dagesh means a doubling of a letter. Okay? But the ones where so in Ashkenazic pronunciation, you see in the Taf, with a dagesh, it's pronounced T, Without a dagesh, it's pronounced S, which is why you hear people use Ashkenazic pronunciation, say mitzvot. They don't say necessarily mitzvot, mitzvos, right? Where you hear them say an S sound instead of a T. That's where they're pronouncing it, where there is no dagesh in the taf.
And that's
Okay.
the distinction between Ashkenazic.
Well, Ashkenazic and modern Israeli, which is a quasi-Sephardic. Okay, it's a quasi-Sephardic because
Yeah, I hear this all the time, but not so much with that, with some other words. I can't remember.
well, the
Shabbat and
Shabbos.
Shabbos.
There's an example: Shabbat and Shabbos.
But the accent also is different.
Yeah, the accent's different, but that's just one obvious example. And by the way, the Ashkenazic, therefore, is retaining a more ancient way of dealing with the taf. Okay? Yeah, you have to understand, just because the Ashkenazic sounds old-fashioned to us doesn't mean that it's less original than the modern Sephardic, because the way modern Hebrew is pronounced today was a reconstructed quasi-Sephardic when Ben Yehuda brought back Hebrew as a spoken language. There's more than one dialect of Hebrew. If you hear Yemenites speak Hebrew, which they did amongst themselves, they never had a vernacular. It sounds a lot like Arabic because they pronounce certain of the letters very similar to Arabic pronunciations. Like they pronounce the ayin, which we don't anymore, and modern Hebrew does not. And actually, Maimonides mentions that. Yes, Mike?
I can't think of the name, but that thin movement
Along with the song.
along with the song pronounced it like that.
Yeah, yes, exactly. There's a woman at Beth Sholem, when she reads Torah, does a kind of she does a kind of older she tries to make differences in some of those letters without the dagesh, like the gimel. She tries to do that, which sounds strange if you're not used to it. So let's read the next one. So that's number one. Nor should one
pronounce the silent shva or silence the pronounced shva.
The shva is the two dots vertical. Sometimes they're pronounced as what's called a glottal stop, right? And sometimes it's not, because when it's at the beginning of a syllable, it's pronounced, but when it's at the end of a syllable, it's just there to mark the end of the syllable. It's not pronounced, okay? Like the at the beginning of a word, meaning and, okay? So he's saying that you have to enunciate it properly so that you make the difference between the what's called the shvana and the shvanach. Read on. Therefore,
one must pause between two words in which the first word ends with the same letter with which the second word begins. For example, when reading
Chol levavcha,
one should pause slightly between bechol and levavcha.
right? Okay. In other words, because you see that.
It just all runs
Yeah, exactly. It all runs together. Go ahead.
Okay, one should act similarly in the cases of
Va'adem.
Mehera.
Yeah, for some reason the Hebrew got reversed here when I. It's hatanaf patil, a kanaf patil.
Patil. One must also pronounce distinctly the Zion of Tizkuru.
Yes, and you sometimes hear people when they're reciting the Shema and they come to the third paragraph, even though they're doing it in a kind of davening mumble, they will say Tizkaru to fulfill this. That's the way I learned how to do it. Okay?
One should sufficiently elongate the Dalet in Echad in order to proclaim God's sovereignty over the heaven and the earth and all four directions.
So you hear people say Echad, like they really extend it out. Go on.
The chet in Echad should not be shortened so that the word sounds like Ichad.
Okay, right? And actually, so in other words, he's telling you to make sure when you're reciting that first line, in order to get the intention right, or the whole recitation of the Shema, you have to say the letters right. I thought this was quite interesting. Okay, now look at number 10.
A person may recite the Shema in any language he understands. One who recites it in a foreign language must be as scrupulous in his enunciation as if he were reciting it in the holy tongue.
This is one of the fascinating things, that there are very few things in our tradition that the halakha demands we recite actually in Hebrew, and none of them are the most common prayers. Okay? Any of our prayers can be recited in another language, including the Shema. Okay? The only things that cannot be recited, it must be recited in Hebrew, are the Birkat Kohanim, the blessings of the priests. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, that must be done in Hebrew because it says in the Torah it's supposed to be recited. There's also the formula that was recited when they brought the first fruits to the temple, where the Torah specifically says this is what you have to say. And so, the most common, most important prayers that we have can be done in the vernacular, if you wish. Okay, and by the way, we know that in the diaspora, in ancient times, in Second Temple period, Jews did that, right? Alexandria, everything they did was in Greek. They even read the Torah in Greek. Okay?
It's very important, otherwise you lose it. People don't know the Hebrew.
Well, that's the point. Most Jews didn't understand Hebrew, and the whole point of this was to make sure that you're doing it with understanding. And let's be honest, before the advent of printing, very few people had any kind of prayer book. There was usually one prayer book for the community, unless you were a wealthy person and had somebody write it out for you. And so if you learned anything, it was by rote, and therefore doing something in the vernacular made it easier for you to do something, right? In other words, Maimonides doesn't want you to say in Hebrew if you haven't a clue what it is you're saying. Now, probably, a lot of the people in his day, around the people he surrounded with, knew the Hebrew somewhat. But as you will see, he eventually will talk about translation. So that's all we're going to look at in terms of the Shema. If you go now to page 88 in our books, he's now going to move on to there's a lot more in the Kriyat Shema. I mean, there's all kinds of details about it. But now we're going to what's called Hilchot Tfilah Ubirkat HaKohanim. Now, the Tfilah is the Amida, okay? Because the Amida is often referred to, has three names. The Amida, which means the standing prayer, as opposed to the Shema, which is done sitting. It's known as the Shemona Esrei because it is 19 blessings in the form we do it now. And it's also called Hatfilah, the prayer, because the Amida incorporates all the classic components of prayer, namely praise, request, thanks. And in the extra material that I asked for you to print out today, I don't have any more copies of it. Ellie, did you print it out? Okay, so if you don't mind, Ed, you don't mind sharing, you'll see here is a chart up at the top of the structure of the Amida. Okay, it begins with 3 blessings of praise, 16 blessings of request, and 3 blessings of thanksgiving or gratitude. Okay, so the Amida has all of the other kinds of prayer. This is what I mailed this out yesterday as an extra page on the printing ones. You'll have to share because I only made out a half a dozen of them. Okay, so that's really what the majority of this section of the Mishneh Torah is about the Amida and how you're supposed to do it, including where you're supposed to do it. And then he goes on to the Birkat Kohanim, but we're going to focus on the Amida. So if we go back to page 88, let's begin reading. Irma, chapter 1, number 1.
To pray daily is an affirmative duty, as it is said, and you shall serve the Lord your God, Exodus. The service here referred to, according to the teaching of tradition, is prayer.
See, that's an interesting point, because the verb avad, which can mean work and is the root of servant and slave, means also the sacrificial service, but also was interpreted by the rabbinic tradition of what they call avodat halev, the service of the heart, which is prayer. So in this pasuk from Exodus is, this verse from Exodus is being interpreted as the notion is considered the mitzvah, the origin of the mitzvah to pray every day. Go on.
As it is said, and to serve him with all your heart, on which the sages commented, what may be described as service of the heart? Prayer. The number of prayers is not prescribed in the Torah. No form of prayer is prescribed in the Torah, nor does the Torah prescribe a fixed time for prayer. Hence, women and slaves are under an obligation to pray, this being a duty, the fulfillment of which is independent of set periods.
So what he's doing here, he's making the claim, therefore, that the Torah only has a command in general to pray, and all the subsequent, what we have in our prayer books, he will say, are rabbinic enactments. Read on. The obligation.
The obligation in this precept is that every person should daily, according to his ability, offer up supplication and prayer, first uttering praises of God, then with humble supplication and petition asking for all that he needs, and finally offering praise and thanksgiving to the Eternal for the benefits already bestowed upon him in rich measure.
There's the whole structure of the Amida there. He says, we are supposed to pray all these kinds of things, right? Praise, petition, thanksgiving. That every day, that's what tefillah to him means. That somehow during each day you must include all three categories of prayer. Yeah.
Wasn't also the prayer the substitution for the sacrifice?
Yeah, that's what I just said. In other words, that as early as the destruction of the first temple, Jews began, when a diaspora, especially when there was no temple for that period, and also as a diaspora developed, there grew up the idea that prayer can substitute for sacrifice. Okay?
I just have a
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
I don't understand the use of the word blessings in this top of the page. I
Yeah.
can understand blessings when you praise because you're blessing God.
Yeah.
But when you request, why is that considered a blessing? When you give thanks, why is that considered a blessing?
Because you are using the formula Baruch Atah. Okay? In other words, if you look at the Amida, every blessing, and I'm using the term in a general sense in the Amida, begins with a paragraph and then ends with the formula Baruch Atah Adonai, whatever, right? Okay? Okay, go on.
One who was fluent would offer up many prayers and supplications. If one was slow of speech, he would pray as he could and whenever he pleased. Thus also, the number of separate services depended on an individual's ability. One would pray once daily, others several times in the day. All, however, turned during prayer to the sanctuary in whichever direction that might be. This was the uniform practice from the time of Moses to those of Ezra.
So notice he's giving us a little historical, the history of prayer, according to his understanding of the rabbinic notions. That originally, people would just pray however they could, whenever they could during the day, and some people could only do a little bit and others did a lot. All right? This is quite interesting because what he's telling us is that while there was a sanctuary, there was the sacrificial services, but there was still this idea of prayer. This is his interpretation of rabbinic sources, but there was no set prayer services the way we had. All right, read the next one too, please.
When the people of Israel went into exile in the days of the wicked Nebuchadnezzar, they mingled with the Persians, Greeks, and other nations.
This is a bit anachronistic here.
In those foreign countries, children were born to them, whose language was confused. Everyone's speech was a mixture of many tongues. No one was able, when he spoke, to express his thoughts adequately in any one language, otherwise than incoherently, as it is said, and their children spoke half in the speech of Ashdod, and they could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people.
Yeah, he's kind of like interpreting that verse in that way. Okay, go on.
Consequently, when any one of them prayed in Hebrew, he was unable adequately to express his needs or recount the praises of God without mixing Hebrew with other languages. When Ezra and his council realized this condition, they ordained the 18 benedictions in their present order.
So traditionally, some rabbinic texts put the Amida back to Ezra. Now we know that this is completely wrong historically. There was no such thing as the Amida. It only emerges in very late Second Temple times, probably only really after the destruction of the temple. But the notion that there's a fixed set of 18 blessings. But nonetheless, he's sort of following rabbinic history here. The rabbi's interpretation of history, that it was Ezra, and then the people who followed him were referred to as the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the men of the Great Assembly. They're the ones who fixed, according to rabbinic interpretation of history, they're the ones who created and fixed the prayers at set times. And for Maimonides, this is for logical reasons, so that everybody is finally learning what they're supposed to say. But you'll notice that by doing this, what is he saying that the fixed prayers, why did they arise?
No one could pray coherently.
Yeah, exactly. They only were done in relation to a problem, right? By the way, there are rabbinic traditions, of course, that proclaim that the 3 prayer services were started by the patriarchs, that they go back to the patriarchs. He's pointedly not putting those in here, okay? Because in the guide, he actually says that the highest form of worship of God is wordless meditation, and that the sacrificial service was only ordained because of the golden calf, and to redirect people's sacrificial impulses to idolatry to God. And so here also, he in effect is saying that if this hadn't happened, we wouldn't need these services. That's a rather radical thing to say, right? All right, Irma, read one more.
The first 3 blessings consist of praises of God, and the last 3 of thanksgiving to him. The intermediate benedictions are petitions for things which may stand as prototypes of all the desires of the individual and the needs of the community. The object aimed at was that these prayers should be in an orderly form in everyone's mouth, that all should learn them, and thus a prayer of those who were not expert in speech would be as perfect as that of those who had command of a chaste style. For the same reason, they arranged in a fixed form all the blessings and prayers for all Jews, so that the substance of every blessing should be familiar and current in the mouth of one who is not expert in speech.
Okay, so again, the whole point of this was the community had declined, and therefore, because of the mixing up of tongues and the growth of ignorance, the rabbis or Ezra stepped forward with his counsel and fixed things. Okay?
There must have been some time when it was codified that things had been.
Yeah, but it's a lot later than he's suggesting. In fact, it's actually the end of the 1st century CE under the council, the rabbis at Yavna. So this is like 600. What actually happened was 600 years later than he's claiming.
Why couldn't it have been that it was established 600 years earlier, and it was oral, and then in the 1st century of the Common Era, someone decided, I'm writing it down?
Not likely, given what we know. First of all, there's no textual evidence for the Amida in the Second Temple period. What also we think is that prayer, which started probably as a substitute, well, first of all, we know people prayed in the First Temple period, but there were actually very few what we would call liturgical prayers, except maybe in the temple, and there's a disagreement over whether that was so. We know that many of the Psalms were liturgy that was done in the temple, in the Second Temple period for sure. So what you actually see in the Second Temple is the emergence, first of all, of temple liturgy. That prayer emerges within the temple itself. And that's actually where the recitation of the Shema probably had its origins. And what happens is that that temple liturgy begins to migrate out to synagogues. In other words, we know that Jews in the diaspora were praying towards Jerusalem. What they were saying, we really don't really know very much. They probably were saying the Shema at some point, probably later on. But other than that, what were they praying? We don't know. Maybe they used Psalms, who knows? But there's no evidence for an Amidah before rabbinic times, really.
Is he ascribing it to Ezra so that it becomes authoritative?
He's following rabbinic tradition here. He's accepting the rabbis' historiography on the evolution of prayer, right?
Maybe that's why the rabbis said that.
Well, yeah, because they themselves know there's no evidence for it in biblical texts, right? In First Temple period, there's no evidence that people actually did any kind of formal prayer services. Sacrificial services, obviously, but not that, right? Okay, so he's making the assumption that at the beginning of the rabbinic period, the Shemona Esrei, the 18 blessings of the Amidah, were already fixed and set. From what we know from people who are experts in the history of the Jewish liturgy, that's just not the case. And that what you had in the early rabbinic period is a number of loose kind of structures that then became codified sometime at the end of the first, beginning of the second century, into a more fixed form, meaning the 18, the Shemona Esrei. Now he's going to give you a bit of another but if it's called the Shemona Esrei, how come there are 19 blessings? Okay, now he's going to give you what the Babylonian Talmud does to explain that contradiction. Okay, Justin, your turn.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, George.
That's
George.
got a bad.
Yeah, sorry, Justin.
No, chapter 2.
Chapter 2 at the bottom of page 89.
Sorry, I'm page
Totally out of it. In the Rabbi Gamliel's days, the number of heretics in Israel increased. They were wont to vex the Israelites and induce them to turn away from God. When Rabbi Gamliel realized that the most urgent need was to remove this evil, he composed a benediction which contains a petition to God to destroy the heretics and incorporated it in the 18 blessings so that it should be in a fixed form for all. Hence, the total number of blessings in the daily service is 19.
Now, that's the Babylonian Talmud's attempt to understand why there are 19 blessings. But in fact, what we know now from liturgical history is that 2 of the blessings in the Palestinian original form were in fact only 1. Okay, there are two of the blessings that refer to the restoration of the Davidic kingdom were in fact only 1 blessing in the original form. And so the Birkat Haminim, the blessings against heretics, which in fact technically is what's called a malefiction as opposed to a benediction, was in fact a singular one that was codified along with all the others. So in the Palestinian liturgy of Eretz Yisrael, there was only 18, but they got split in the Babylonian one, so the Babylonian Gemara doesn't understand it, so they make up this story. Okay? The fact is that the original Amidah had the Birkat Minim, the blessings against heretics, as part of the original 18. Now, here's where I've given you. This is a very interesting discussion. Now, I've just given you what Larry Hoffman and other liturgical historians said happened. That the Babylonian Gemara just didn't understand because it was hundreds of years later what was going on, and they made up this story based on the fact that in the Mishnah it says that Rabbi Gamliel was the one who fixed the Amidah, and then he asked, then they, and they put, and then they made this, one of them was this one against the Minim. So if you look at the material I just gave you, how do we know what I just said is true? That in the Cairo Geniza, there is an early, there is a manuscript with the liturgy of Eretz Yisrael before the censorship that occurred later on. You have to understand, a lot of Jewish texts were censored by Christian authorities. So this is pre-censorship because the manuscript dates from the 10th or 11th centuries. So it's very early. And it's Eretz Yisrael, it's not Babylonian. So it reflects only 18 blessings.
How do they know that it's from Eretz Israel?
Because they know from where the liturgy, the
Other sections?
other parts of it, they know this is an Eretz Yisrael, not a Babylonian liturgical text. Now, what's fascinating is, to me, of course, is what it was, what the original blessing said, because this is probably the text of the original blessing from early rabbinic times that got changed under the pressure of censorship. So I've given you the two versions. Okay, so take a look at the original version of what is often referred to as the punishment of the heretics. Okay, first of all, it says, "May there be no hope for apostates." Okay, now here I want to say one thing. According to many liturgical historians, when you look at the topics of the middle blessings, remember you've got 16 middle blessings. The first, you can actually divide them up according to sort of themes, and the first number of them seem to be more personal, and the latter numbers seem to be more communal. And even Maimonides alludes to that in what he just said. But many historians now believe that in fact each one of these 16 or 15 blessings were responses to particular historical events, namely the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70, and, in the case of this one, the rise of the Christian community. First being Jews who were Christians, and then Gentiles who were Christians. And that very likely that's what this is referring to. Okay, so take a look what it says. "May there be no hope for apostates, and may you quickly uproot the insolent reign in our day," or this should be their insolent reign in our day, "and may the Christians and heretics instantly perish." In Hebrew, the word is notzrim, meaning Nazareans, right? That was their term for Christians. Now, they're probably referring to Judeo-Christians, Christians who are ethnically Jewish, right? And minim, of course, is the general rabbinic term for a heretic, a mean. Okay? "May they be erased from the book of life, and may they not be written with the righteous. Blessed are you, Lord, who humbles the insolent." Zadim. Okay? That's the original way the blessing was done. You will not find that in any prayer books today. Okay? If you want to go, the typical one in the traditional Ashkenazic prayer book, and the Sephardic is a little different, but essentially it's the same, is what you see below. "May there be no hope for slanderers." Notice, no longer apostates. "And may all wickedness instantly perish, and may all your enemies be quickly destroyed. May you quickly uproot, smash, destroy, and humble the insolent quickly in our day. Blessed are you, Lord, who smashes his enemies and humbles the insolent." That's very different, isn't it? But that's the censored version. Okay? What's interesting, of course, is that modern denominations have done various things with this blessing. Apparently Abraham Geiger, one of the founders of the Reform movement in the 19th century, completely altered this blessing, wrote a whole new text for it. In some Reform liturgies, they just took it out completely. Okay? The Reconstructionists keep it but change the Hebrew significantly to sort of get away from this vindictive sort of thing. typically for the conservative movement, which I am a member of, they keep the text as you see it in the Ashkenazic one, but here's how they translate it. Frustrate the hopes of those who malign us. Let all evil very soonly disappear. Let all your enemies soon be destroyed. May you quickly uproot and crush the arrogant. May you subdue and humble them in our time. Praised are you, Lord, who humbles the arrogant. Kind of really tones it down, doesn't it?
This is one of the 18 prayers?
Yeah, this is one part of the traditional Amida. Again, many Reform Gates of Prayer just, I think, took it out completely. I don't know what they're doing in the modern Reform Prayer book.
I'll bring in one of those.
Well, the one that we have is only for Shabbat. The one that's so far been published, well, I guess no, it should have it.
The one for Hagim has weekday, but I don't know if they have it here.
Yeah, they don't know if they have it here. But the reconstructionists, I don't have the text in front of me. But
they have the full one.
They change it. The reconstructionists have changed this paragraph. I didn't include that because I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on this. But the point is, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is something else. My math is making me crazy.
Yeah.
You got 3 blessings of praise, 16 blessings of request, and 3 blessings of thanksgiving.
Yeah,
how is that 19?
Yeah, that's a mistake in the chart. Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Well, it's not your chart, Rabbi.
No, I know it isn't my chart. I don't know why I didn't notice that.
Should it be one of the
It's
praise and one of the thanksgivings?
it should be 6 and 6 and 13. It should be 3 and 3. It should be 13, not
Not 6.
They make it
Not 60.
pretty.
Oh, here it is. Yeah, they really cut it. They've restored it, but they've cut it down considerably.
Is that the new?
This is the new one. It says, and for
This is what group?
this is Reform, the new Reform.
What's the title of the text?
This is Mishkan Tefillah that just came out a couple of years ago.
Rabbi Fishman was
yeah.
the principal author of it.
Right. And for wickedness, let there be no hope. And may all the errant, they use the word people who are mistaken, v'hat to'im, may all the errant return to you, and may the realm of wickedness, umalchut zadon, mehera tishaber, be shattered. Praised are you, Adonai, whose will it is that the wicked vanish from the earth. That's a big, big editorial change.
That's the English.
No, that pretty reflects the Hebrew. But the Hebrew's changed too, completely.
Changed the Hebrew.
Completely.
Major surgery.
Major surgery on the Hebrew. The Reconstructionists did also surgery on the Hebrew. Typically for the conservative movement, they leave the Hebrew as it is, but fudge the English.
Right.
All right? Now, that's the Sim Shalom, the old Sim Shalom from the early 80s. I don't know what they did with the later Sim Shalom, and they're in the middle of doing a whole new one again, so I have no idea what they're going to do with it, but it's very typical of the conservative movement to say, well, we're traditional enough, we're keeping the Hebrew as it is, because we don't want to change it, but we're going to fudge the translation, because most people don't know how to read Hebrew, right? And when I was on the committee originally for the new High Holiday Machzor, I said, you can't do this anymore. You know, if you don't want to change the Hebrew, then give them a translation that actually says what it is, because when people find out about it, they're really upset. Like, what do you mean it doesn't say that? You know, yeah, Sam.
Wouldn't you consider this surgery on the first?
Oh yeah, yes. The original, what ended up being the Ashkenazic version and the Sephardic version is basically the same, although the text is a little different. Is radical surgery because of censorship. There's several.
So it's just another operation, basically.
Yeah, it was.
What the Reform have done.
Yeah, but I think what they tried to do in the traditional Ashkenazic and Sephardic versions was it's kind of code language for the same thing. You know what I mean? In other words, they're kind of basically trying to say more or less the same thing, but
they don't want to say Christian, so they say something else.
Yeah, and by the way, this happened in another important prayer. By the way, the Aleinu. The Aleinu prayer had a line, which may be pre-Christian, but Christians assumed referred to Jesus. right? They worship it says basically they worship a God who is hollow and without any substance or something like.
להבל ולריק.
Yeah, exactly. Vanity and hollowness, and Christians thought this was an attack on Jesus, so it was censored out of the Amida. Although in modern Israeli things they put it back in. And what's interesting is I probably think it was an attack on Christianity.
I think it was.
Oh, I think it probably was, because there's a very old tradition that when you come to that line, you're supposed to spit on the floor as a sign of contempt. Seriously. What's fascinating is, of course, is in the 20th century, people began to realize that spitting on the floor was incredibly unhygienic. There's an old synagogue in Toronto, one of these old synagogues built in the 30s that's been preserved as a classic Eastern European synagogue, and there's a sign in Yiddish that says no spitting on the floor. And they would, how did they alleviate this? By supplying spittoons. So these old synagogues had spittoons. Now, some of it undoubtedly was for people who were chewing tobacco, but most of it was so that people wouldn't spit on the floor during the Aleinu prayer. I actually saw this happening when I was an undergraduate at Hebrew University, and I spent Rosh Hashanah at the Chabad synagogue in the old city. I actually saw people doing this in Jerusalem, because it was a stone floor, and they spit on the floor, and then they kind of rubbed it with their shoe to get it into the stone. But I mean, it was like I didn't know what I had no idea what the hell they were doing when I first saw this. But this was apparently a hygienic problem in synagogues in North America in the 20s and 30s, that they had to ban spitting on the floor. Yeah.
Just say what I remember from Gates of Prayer was that a number of prayers they would tell you with little asterisks, this is a sort of a free interpretation.
Yes.
Which I found frustrating.
Yeah, and what you actually find is that because the beginning of the traditional Aleinu is such an attack upon idolatry and seems to be kind of Jewish, very much Jewish sort of triumphalism, there are many modern versions or different versions of the Aleinu that have been written, especially in the Reform liturgy, somewhat in the Reconstructionists, and the conservative left it alone, and so obviously the Orthodox, but a lot of people had problems with the Aleinu service. The first paragraph, second paragraph is okay, but the first paragraph, there's been a lot of different versions of it that have been written to sort of downplay all of this. But what's fascinating to me is that in modern Israeli prayer books, along with Jewish sovereignty, we have the right to go back and say whatever the heck we want, and so they've restored this line in Israeli prayer books. Yeah, Robert.
You keep using the word censored.
Yes.
And I had always interpreted censors as being an official who imposed.
Yes.
But during this discussion now, it's become apparent to me, this has been from within. Very often, not necessarily from without.
There was both external censorship and internal censorship. In other words, for example, there are probably about 20 references to Jesus in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, written at a time of polemic, so they're not nice. Okay, there's very little good to say. Now, that when these were written, this was all. None of them reflect any real history about Jesus. They're all written at much later. They're all polemics against Christianity, and some of them are pretty scurrilous. I mean, this was very typical for religious polemics in the period of Christianity. What Christians were saying against Jews and what Jews were saying against Christians. Anyway, in almost all. Up until recently, all printed editions of the Talmud had all these parts censored out by Christian censors.
By Christian censors?
Yes, Christian censors. The reason why we know they exist is because in the only manuscript copy we have of the entire Babylonian Talmud, the Munich manuscript, because there's from the Middle Ages, it's the only one that survived. They're all there. So in some modern editions of the Talmud, they put them back in, right? And by the way, the end of the Mishneh Torah was also censored when it refers to Jesus, and it's been restored because we have the early manuscripts of the Mishneh Torah. But all printed editions of the Mishneh Torah up until the modern period were censored out of any references to Jesus.
But why do you say external censorship?
Because there were people who were Jewish converts to Christianity who told the authorities about this stuff, and they were officially censored. And you find in the front of Hebrew books printed, you find a censor's approval, Christian censor's approval of the text, that it passed muster. Okay? So in some cases, the Jews self-censored, but mostly it was from the outside. Mostly it's from the outside.
How would you say 19 prayers?
What do you mean?
Instead of saying 18. Shmoni Esrei.
Well, as I said, the original one only had 18, but the Babylonian version, they split. There's one prayer for the restoration of the Davidic kingdom that got split into two.
Shmoni Esrei is 18.
18,
prayers.
right.
How would you say 19 prayers?
You would say Tishasrei. Shasrei.
Shasrei.
Yeah.
Why did they change it?
Because just one of those things nobody does.
Because we don't.
It became a name.
Yeah, it just became a name. Okay, George, you want to continue? You want
Also,
to?
maybe because
George
Manasseh
is
has the
taking care
high
of the
element in
messages.
it.
Who knows? All right. George ducked out. Okay. Robert, you want to do number 2 then? In each of the three.
Page 90?
Yeah,
each of
page
the
90,
three
yeah.
daily services, a person recites these appropriately numbered blessings in their appointed order, but only if he finds that his mind is in a fit state for prayer and he is fluent in speech. That's Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
But if one is distracted and harassed, or is not fluent in speech, he should recite the first 3 blessings, a blessing embodying the gist of all the intermediate blessings, and the last 3 blessings, and then he has fulfilled his duty.
Okay, so, and don't forget, this is all from memory. This is not from a text, a written text in Maimonides' day. You have to know them from memory. And by the way, if you don't know them and you attend a service, that's the reason why traditionally the Amida was repeated. In other words, you did it. If you go to a traditional service, first of all, there's what's called the silent Amida, right? Where everybody says it silently, mumbling in the davening fashion to themselves. And then it's repeated by the Chazan or the Shaliach Tzibur. And at the end of every blessings, you say Amen. Well, for people who didn't know the prayers, that's the reason why they repeated it publicly. Because if you just say Amen to the out loud recitation by the prayer leader, that is fulfilling your obligation to say the Shemona Esrei. Now, Maimonides, by the way, a lot of congregations have adopted what's called a Heicha Kedusha, where the first part of the Amida is recited publicly, out loud, by everybody together in unison to the end of the Kedusha, which is that addition that's added in, and then the rest of it is done silently. Okay? And apparently Maimonides preferred that, and because it shortens the service, because often during the public recitation of the Amida, people talk, they wander around, they're not really listening, But and in fact, with the advent of printed prayer books in front of anybody, it's really not necessary to repeat it out loud. But of course, cantors wouldn't like that. Because that's one of the ways in which they get to
Show off.
well, yeah, do what they do, right? Okay, Robert, you want to do number 3?
The blessing that they ordained as a summary of the intermediate blessing is as follows. Give us understanding, O God, O Lord our God, to know your ways and circumcise our hearts to fear you. Be forgiving of us so that we may be redeemed. Keep us far from sorrow, make us prosperous, cause us to dwell in the pastures of your land, gather the scattered from the 4 corners of the earth, let them go astray in the knowledge of you be judged. Go astray in the knowledge of you be judged. And over the wicked wave your hand, let the righteous rejoice in the rebuilding of your city and the re-establishment of your temple, and in the flourishing of the horn of David, your servant, and in the rekindling of the light of Jesse's son, your anointed. Before we call, do you answer? Before we speak, do you hearken? As it is said, And it shall come to pass before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear. For you are he who answers in all times of trouble, and who delivers and rescues from all distress. Blessed are you, our Lord, who hearkens to prayer.
Okay,
That's the summary.
that's the summary. The Havienu is, if you don't have, and this is discussed in the Talmud, if you don't have time for whatever reasons, or you find yourself traveling and you're in a place where it could be dangerous, and you can't say the entire Amida, you say the Havienu. Okay, and the Havienu is still somewhere. Here it is in the conservative prayer book. It's a little more elaborate, but well, no, that's just an abridged one.
When you say the Havienu, you said if you don't have time?
Yeah, if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have time because you're supposed to do the 3 services at particular set times during the day within a certain period of time, and you find you're coming to the end of it and you've got it and you haven't been able to do it, so you do it, or you find you're in a place where you got to do it quickly because like you're traveling on the road and you don't want to stop because it could be dangerous, it could be robbers. So you know what I'm saying is that the rabbis provided people with a short form of the Amida that touches on all of the themes of the Amida. And that's what he's referring to here, and he gives you the text. Okay?
Where is that? Is that in-
Well, he says the blessing that follows, where it starts from give us
90,
understanding.
number 3.
Page
Oh,
90.
that's the Havienu.
Yeah, that's the Havienu.
Okay.
Okay? So that's why he does it. And again, this goes back to Talmudic, to the Gemara. Okay. Paul, do you want to read, we're starting chapter 4 now, number 1.
And how do you translate Havienu?
Well, it's give us understanding.
Havienu means give us understanding.
Yep.
Well, bring us to.
Bring us to understanding, yeah.
There are 5 requests, the absence of which hinders the proper recital of a service. Even when its due time has arrived, cleansing the hands, covering the body, assuring as to the cleanliness of the place where the prayers are recited, removal of distraction, and concentration of the mind.
Notice he says there are things that you have to have in order to be able to properly do the prayers. Things which you must do and things which will prevent you from doing the proper thing. So first of all, you're supposed to wash your hands. Secondly, you have to have your body covered, right? Thirdly, the cleanliness of the place where the prayers are recited. Now, you'll notice that Tversky then skips to Halakha 15. If you take, and we're going to look at some of them, one of the things, basically he goes through a number of paragraphs about what do you do to avoid being in a place where there's excrement, right? Because you're not supposed to play in a place where there's human excrement. And this is, of course, an important issue in the Middle Ages where they don't have sewage systems, right? So I didn't include that part, but, and Tversky doesn't either. But if you go back, human excrement primarily, but any kind of excrement actually. I mean, I guess if you're in a field with, cow flaps. But take a look on the first, on page 2 of the material, extra material I gave you on prayer. Ellie, do you want to read number 10? So I left out the stuff about excrement, but I decided to, this is what I sent out last week and also yesterday. Chapter 4, number 10, things that might hinder and bother and distract him. Okay, so I'm skipping the cleanliness of the place. Now he's going to go through removals of distraction. Okay, so now he's going to start listing them.
Excuse me, before you get to that.
Yeah.
Covering the body, is that the talit, or is that?
No,
just
not praying while you're naked.
Oh, just being dressed.
Okay, so again, that's parts I didn't give you. He has several paragraphs on making sure making sure you're dressed. You're not allowed to pray naked. But what happens if in the morning, when you're supposed to say the morning prayer, and you may not be, there's an issue. It's considered dishonorable to God to pray naked. Okay? And then, so he does nakedness, and he does cleanliness of the place, and now he's going to talk about distractions. So, Ellie, do you want to read number 10? Things that might bother and distract him.
Things that might bother and distract him. What is implied? One who must relieve himself should not pray. Whenever anyone who must relieve himself prays, his prayer is an abomination. He must pray again after he relieves himself. If a person can restrain himself for the length of time that it takes to walk a parsah, his prayer is considered prayer. Nevertheless, a priori, one should not pray until he has checked himself very well, checked his intestines, rid himself of phlegm and mucus and any other bothersome thing. Only afterwards should he pray.
This is very interesting, isn't it? Yeah. That, if you shouldn't pray if you've got a feeling like you really need to go to the bathroom. Okay, so that, first of all, because it's a distraction. Because you're going to be sitting there thinking, man, I gotta go, and you're not going to be focusing on the prayers. And by the way, I think somewhere else he also says it's very unhealthy that if you have to go, you hold it in. Okay?
That's what my mother always says.
All right, now read number 11, because now he's going to get into things other than that.
The following rules apply to one who burps, yawns, or sneezes during prayer. Should a person do so voluntarily, it is depreciated.
Meaning it's really
Deprecating.
deprecating. It's very dishonorable during prayer to do any of that if you can, intentionally go on. However,
if the person checked himself before he prayed and did so against his will, it is of no consequence. If saliva comes up during prayer, one should cause it to be absorbed into his talit.
in other words, don't spit on the floor. Right? Yeah.
If he is bothered by this, he may throw it behind him with his hand in order that he not be bothered during his prayer.
Don't stand behind someone who does that.
Be distracted. If one passes gas unwittingly during prayer, he should wait until the gas subsides and return to his prayer.
Okay. In other words, he's talking about things that might, unintentionally happen during prayer. Like all of a sudden you've got some phlegm, you hock it up, and what do you do with it, right?
He covers everything. It's just
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? I mean, this is from real life, right? Yeah.
I had an experience once. I was at a bar mitzvah at the Family Jewish Center.
Yes.
And there was a couple sitting in...
No names, please.
a couple sitting in front of me who I didn't know. And the man was somehow, I won't say aroused, but he was stroking a woman next to her in her hair. And it wasn't just absent-mindedly like this, He was looking at her and stroking her hair and fondling her hair. It was very distracting. And I wondered, should I say something? Should I get to him, up to him and say, please? I mean, everybody around was looking at this going on because we were looking up front at the bima. And I just wondered, what should I have said or done?
Somebody should have said, get a room. No. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really inappropriate behavior. I mean, why would somebody do that in public in a synagogue of all places? Yeah, I mean, I think it would have been appropriate to...
Please stop.
Yes, or have an usher tell them or something like that. Absolutely. Boy, that's weird. All right, now read the next one as well.
One who desires to pass gas from below and is bothered exceedingly to the extent that he cannot restrain himself should walk back 4 cubits, expel the gas, and then wait until the gas subsides. You should say, Master of all the world, you created us with many orifices. Shame and disgrace is apparent and known before you. Shame and disgrace during our life, worm-eaten and decaying in our death. Then he returns to his place and prays.
Now, that little prayer, by the way, is a shortened version of the blessing you're supposed to say after you finish coming out of the bathroom. There is a bracha that you're supposed to say when you come out of the bathroom that thanks God that all your parts are working correctly. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because it says if, there are many tubes and pipes, holes in pipes actually, And if one of them should open when they should be closed, and if one of them closed when it should be open, then we wouldn't be able to live. And of course, as I always like to joke, when I present that blessing, the older you get, the more you appreciate that blessing. But the point is, what he's got here is a kind of short version of it, or a similar, very similar to that blessing. Most of the language is virtually the same, except for the last part.
The disgrace part.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, as long as you walked away, that's not a disgrace. You're just exercising nature.
Yeah, but you have to understand, again, being in the Middle Ages, there was this notion that the body, Maimonides is a little less than this than many others, but, the body is inferior to the soul because it's the source of horrible things like gas and excrement and all this kind of stuff. And so, the soul is the part of you that's pure. So you're getting a little medieval kind of deprecation of the body here. All right. Okay, Ed, do you want to read the next one, number 13?
When urine flows.
Yeah, I think you've had enough of that, Allie.
When urine flows on a person's legs during Shemona Esrei, he should wait until the flow ceases and return to the place at which he stopped. If he waited the time necessary to complete his Shemona Esrei, he should return to the beginning.
Beginning of what?
Of the prayer.
You should say that prayer.
Yeah, right.
Well,
Yeah, I think so. Similarly.
Similarly, one who urinates should wait the length of time it takes to walk 4 kilos and then pray. After one has prayed, he should wait this length of time before urinating in order to make a distinction following the wisdom.
What is he talking about here? He's talking about people who are incontinent, right?
Yeah.
He's a doctor. He's dealing with
Exactly. And there's all kinds of reasons why people can become incontinent. And they didn't have, ways of stopping it. And so he, in effect, is, a person could be in the middle of davening and be really embarrassed by it, but also want to know, okay, so now what do I do? And he's giving you what you're supposed to do. Okay, so let's go back to the text in page 90, where he's now going to talk about, he's dealt with all of the distractions, bodily and whatever, and now he's going to talk about the mental aspect of this, which is what Tversky goes for. Obviously skips all that other stuff, which actually I thought was really interesting. Anyway, so Ed, you want to read on number 15, concentration of the mind.
How is this condition to be fulfilled? Any prayer uttered without mental concentration is not prayer. If a service has been recited without such concentration, it must be recited again devoutly. A person finds that his thoughts are confused and his mind is distracted. He may not pray till he has recovered his mental composure. Hence, on returning from a journey, or if one is weary or distressed, it is forbidden to pray till his mind is composed. The sages said that he should wait 3 days till he is rested and his mind is calm, and then he recites the prayer.
Now, what he refers to as concentration of the mind in Hebrew is kavanat halev, because the lev, the heart, was considered to be the seat of the mind. Okay, so kavanah is intention, meditation. In fact, there's statements in the Mishnah about that every time you should be. In the early period there was even an argument as to whether there should be set prayers, because set prayers take away from the notion of proper spontaneity and kavanah. In other words, if they're not really your words, there's a danger you're just going to recite them. And this is one of the great conundrums of Jewish prayer, that there are so many words traditionally that we are supposed to recite. And how can we recite all of these words with kavanah, with proper intention and feeling, so that they are of the heart? Because notice he uses the term kavanat halev, concentration from the heart, right? This is one that is still an issue today, and it's one of the reasons for people who have amended the service. It's one of the reasons for shortening the service, was to focus on fewer prayers. It's the reason for the evolution of what we call the renewal movement form of prayer, what people in my family like to call the happy clappy services. You know, the influence of Shlomo Carlebach and his style of praying and his melodies that have gone throughout the denominations, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist, because people are trying to focus on ways to achieve proper kavanah. This was especially important, by the way, in Kabbalistic circles, but you see it was important to Maimonides in his own day. Again, he didn't want people reciting prayers as rote. And of course, I think the fact that we have printed text makes it all the more easier to do that, as opposed to doing it from memory. Okay?
I've seen, we're supposed to go, some of us, intermittently to the morning services to be sure there's a minyan, particularly when we're saying prayer for the deceased.
Yes.
And what bothers me about that is that the prayers are raced. They race through the prayers and they throw the pages.
Yes.
Not as if out of the book. Turn the pages, they throw them.
Is this a conservative reform service?
Conservative.
Yes. Again, that's the conundrum. We're a traditional service, so we've got to say all the prayers. So we have to race through them because in the morning, what time is the service usually? 7:30. 7:30. People got to get to work, so we race through the service. And this turns off a lot of people, let's be perfectly honest, and especially what we call the Psuke de Zimra, the preliminary prayers, which are mostly recitations of Psalms. People are like, why are we racing through these? Why do we even say them at all? By the way, actually, the whole point of them is you're not really supposed to focus on those because the whole idea of the Psuke de Zimra is that the recitation of holy words from the Bible starts to get your mind in a place where it's ready to concentrate when you get to the service itself, which starts with the Baruch Hu, right? The public call to prayer. But be that as it may, I think this is still it's a very live issue in the community because again, how much do you cut? And it still feels, put whatever word you want in there, traditional, mandatory, meaningful. In other words, how far do you go, right, to shorten services?
To make it meaningful.
To focus on more prayers. I mean, and even if you did cut the service down, a traditional service, would in fact people focus on the prayers? And how do you get people to focus on prayers? So one of the modern techniques of the renewal movement is to use music and melody and chanting to do that.
It's Hasidic too, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's Carlebach got it out of the Hasidic tradition, but let's face it, what he did was something very different than even traditional Hasidic prayer was. Well, just because of the amount of melodies and things like that. I mean, yes, traditionally in Hasidic circles you have the nigun, which is the wordless chant, but he went much further than that.
He was just talented.
Well, he was very talented as a composer, and his melodies have become very common. They're very catchy. They're very upbeat, as opposed to some of the more traditional melodies, which are a little more, not so
recitative-like.
Well, they're more dignified and kind of. They're more like Central European music. A lot of our traditional melodies come out of Central European Jewish composers, right? Am I correct in that, Cantor?
Well, it's such a wide.
Yeah, I mean there are American ones too, but some of our most well-known ones.
Well, depends if you refer to the Reform like Lewandowski and.
Yeah, exactly. I am
like
talking
classical music. But
yeah,
they were always influenced by opera and by.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
troubadour singing.
Even the traditional melody for the Shema Yisrael.
Yeah,
exactly. Somebody composed that.
Yeah.
Most people think it came from Moses, but it was composed, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the old melody for Adon Olam, the opening of the Ark melody. These are all compositions from a particular period. Some of them come out of folk tradition. Yeah, some of them are. So it's an interesting issue because some people like the old melodies, like the old style, and other people find it dull and not uplifting. And not allowing them to get into, that's the way we would say, kavanah. I think it's a very interesting issue. Yeah, Paul. You have your own preferences in the matter, right? Everybody does. I mean, so do I, right? And usually what you're brought up with is often the thing that you most like. Right. I remember there was an argument at the first synagogue I was at as an assistant rabbi. The cantor introduced a new melody for Ein Kelohenu. And one of the members of the ritual committee was furious. This ancient traditional melody, and the cantor retorted, well, it's a German drinking song melody, which it is. Okay? I mean, part of the traditional melody for the Kiddush is the Ode to Joy from Beethoven. Da na 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 na, right? It's if you chant the paragraph of the Shabbat Friday night Kiddush, part of it is right out of the Ode to Joy. I mean, people did that. I mean, even the Hasidim picked up stuff from Mozart in some of their nigunim.
And you know what? Rabbi Nachman even went to the field and took tunes from the shepherds.
Exactly. So, to me, it's often, what did you learn as a child? Right? Okay. We will continue next week, where he on this section on page 91, where he goes on with what does it mean. This is for him the internal for him. He's dealt with all the externalities now, right? Now he's really dealing with the internal aspects of it, which for him are central. We'll see you next week then.
Where was Carlsbach?
Carlbach was here in New York. He had a little synagogue, the House of Love and Prayer, he called it, right?
It's on 79th Street.
Yeah.
So the Carlsbach Shul is the Carlsbach Shul.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where he was. And he is one of the most, in terms of the way services have been impacted, he has been